Hello and most welcome to 1576 of the Heidegger series. We will continue with the read of Joachim Schulte's Experience and Expression, Wittgenstein's philosophy of psychology, and we are currently in chapter 6, Objects of Vision, page 82. And we've been talking about Wolfgang Köhler and his influence on Ludwig Wittgenstein. How it triggered a lot of thinking in Wittgenstein, and in the end was a great impetus for his developing philosophical investigations and more. What the Gestalt theorists run the risk of doing is ascribing too much ontological status to the visual objects. And thereby producing a sort of fixation of sorts. Now I continue on page 82, the penultimate paragraph from the bottom. Thus the Gestalt theoretic conception runs the risk of ascribing too much ontological independence to its visual objects. But what we have not understood so far is how much of a risk that is. After all, this criticism seems to affect a purely theoretical, even speculative element of that conception. To get clearer about it, we shall have to find a more clearly defined context where real errors may be discovered that are due to the idea that an object of perception is a unified, circumscribed object which can be directly grasped as such an object. One of Köhler's main theses amounts to the claim that the perception of pure gestalts is a precondition of the possibility of lending sense to an object. In other words, it is said that one first recognizes objects or groups of objects as gestalts, and thus sees them as visual objects. For example, then in a second step gives them a meaning. Of course, the notion of sense or meaning employed in this context is extremely vague. But before continuing this discussion, let us look at Köhler's own formulation of his thesis. Sensory units have acquired names. Have become richly symbolic and are now to have certain practical uses. While nevertheless they have existed as units before any of these further facts were added. Gestalt psychology claims that it is precisely the original segregation of circumscribed wholes, which makes it possible for the sensory world to appear so utterly imbued with meaning to the adult. For its gradual entrance into the sensory field, meaning follows the lines drawn by natural organization. It usually enters into segregated wholes. It is this thesis of the priority of Gestalt over meaning which Wittgenstein wishes to reject when he remarks that noticing a Gestalt switch is perceiving a meaning. For example, hearing a tone either as the beginning of a new musical phrase or as the end of the preceding phase. By saying this, Wittgenstein does not want to claim that our biological constitution makes us incapable of recognizing certain gestalts without knowing the meanings. That is, without knowing their possible uses, their symbolic value, their names, and so on. Rather, the point is that the hypothesis that we can perceive gestalts without giving them a meaning is vague and useless if we are trying to clarify and understand basic concepts like perceive, see, feel, and so forth. Wittgenstein does not deny, for instance, that a man who lived 1,000 years ago could have grasped the idea that a drawing of a railway engine was the representation of an object, but this man would not have been able to introduce this drawing into a language game. He would merely have been able to say things like this figure here unaided. He would not even have been in a position to say the thing which has been drawn here, since without additional information he could not have known whether or not this figure was a representation of something. In particular, the question whether it was a drawing of one or more things would have been absolutely unanswerable for him. We, on the other hand, are not only able to see this drawing as a representation of something, but as a representation of various things, of a railway engine, a sculpture of a railway engine, a toy railway engine, and so on. And here it would be obviously mistaken to claim that every time we see the figure as this or that, we are perceiving a different gestalt to which we are in addition ascribing a meaning. Of course, it cannot be denied that we can see something as an independent, separate object without being able to specify what kind of object it is. And if the claim that without this capacity we should never have been able to invest any objects with meaning is regarded as a scientific hypothesis, it may well be justifiable. But if the thesis of the priority of Gestalt over meaning amounted to no more than such a hypothesis, it would be fairly irrelevant regarding foundational problems about our psychological concepts. As soon as it is taken as a thesis about our concepts, however, Wittgenstein's criticism appears convincing for the following reason. When the word see is used in its normal way, we speak of seeing trees, houses, motor cars, children, and so on. To say merely that I see an object or a thing is legitimate and intelligible only in a context which is well defined in most other respects. Thus, I may say that to the left of that tree over there, behind the house, I can see an object. what we do not and cannot say are things like, to the left of that thing over there, behind that thing, I can see an object, etc. That this sort of utterance is excluded does not merely amount to saying that the language of perception could not work that way, but that here we cannot even speak of perception at all. For perception does not mean seeing or hearing pure gestalts without further characteristics. No, it involves perceiving that things are this or that, and it is precisely this fact which makes it possible that on certain occasions one and the same thing can be seen as either this or that. Objects fulfill certain functions in our lives, and these functions are connected with the meanings we ascribe to them. But Wittgenstein does not want to establish a counter-thesis to the one held by Köhler. He does not want to claim that perception presupposes meaning or something of that kind. He merely wishes to point out that an act of direct perception refers not merely to a pure gestalt or to a circumscribed something, but includes its meaning or parts of its meaning. if you are, for example, looking at a maritime chart, we may suddenly notice that at one time we see Italy as a figure and the Mediterranean as a ground, while at another time we see the Mediterranean as figure and Italy as ground. But that does not mean that at one time we grasp this and at another time that object, and in addition certain meanings. What it means is that we perceive a thing together with its meaning and notice that it is possible to see it as having a different meaning. That is the point of Wittgenstein's statement that we see not only gestalts but also meanings. The thesis of the priority of gestalt over meaning does not agree with the content of our normal concept of seeing something. And that is why Köhler's attempt to give pride to place pure gestalts runs the risk of causing conceptual confusions. Excursus, sense data. Moore's theory. It is striking that Moore, in his discussions of the problems of sense perception, seems to be dealing with one sense only. The sense of sight. This fact has been noticed by several commentators, and in spite of More's protests against some of their remarks, it is quite obviously true that virtually all his examples concern visual perception. In reply to his critics, More claims, "I have always both used and intended to use sense datum in such a sense that the mere fact that an object is directly apprehended is a sufficient condition for saying that it is a sense datum, so that according both to my usage and my intentions, directly apprehended smells and tastes and sounds are just as much sense data as directly seen objects. It remains a fact, however, that the seeing of objects constitutes More's paradigm of sense perception. In this context, More asks various types of question. For example, what is it that I am judging when I judge as I now do that is an inkstand? Or what is it that happens when we see a material object? And in general, he proceeds to answer these questions by giving an outline of the elements he believes to be involved not only in every standard case of actually seeing a physical object or material thing, but also in every case of dreaming or having hallucinations or images or after images. According to Moore, experiences of this latter kind can, at least up to a point, be quite indistinguishable from perceiving material things. The entities experienced in both kinds of experience, he says, can stand in the same relation to the subject of these experiences. Obviously, the entities experienced both in cases of sensations proper and in cases of dreaming, hallucinating, etc., cannot be physical objects. These entities are what Moore calls sense data, or as he sometimes prefers to say, sensibles. These sense data or sensibles are to be distinguished not only from the physical objects, which they may, in cases of genuine sense perception, be said to be present, but also from a number of mental occurrences that may be connected with my having or perceiving or experiencing certain sense data. The distinction intended by Moore can perhaps be brought out in this way when, for example, I am looking at a certain physical object, a teacup, say, then what I am directly perceiving, or as Moore prefers to say, directly apprehending, is not the material teacup, but a sense datum of this teacup, my apprehending it. However, it is not the same thing as the sense datum. I am apprehending. It is a mental process which in turn can be an object of my attention. This is the reason why Moore keeps insisting on his distinction between sensations and sense data. Even if sense data cannot, as a matter of fact, exist unperceived, they are not mental occurrences of the same kind as our perceiving them. Even if they are in some sense dependent on my mind, they are not dependent on it in the same way my seeing, hearing, smelling, etc. are dependent on my mind. As Moore puts it, I look at an envelope and I see a sense datum. A patch of whitish color. But now I immediately turn away my eyes, and I no longer see that sense datum. My seeing of it has ceased to exist. But I am by no means sure that the sense datum, that very same patch of whitish color which I saw, is not still existing and still there. It seems to me at least conceivable that it should be still existing, whereas my seeing of it certainly has ceased to exist. This is one reason for distinguishing between the sense data which I see and my seeing of them. But what are More's reason for introducing sense data at all? It is remarkable that More does not seem very worried by this question. And this indicates a fundamental change of the philosophical climax of his day and ours. More was far more anxious to persuade his contemporaries to accept the common sense belief in physical objects, the real existence of the world, etc., than to justify his assumption of the existence of sense data. And it may very well be the case that he himself saw fewer problems regarding their existence than regarding the past existence of the material world, for example. Accordingly, he does not make much of the usual argument from illusion and similar attempts to justify the assumption of sense data, but simply proceeds to analyze the role which sense data are supposed to play in certain types of judgment, especially in judgments of perception. Let us take what Moore considers a typical judgment of perception, such as "this is a teacup," uttered in the conspicuous presence of a teacup. Now, according to Moore, it is evident that this judgment is not a judgment about the material teacup standing on the sideboard, or at least not exclusively about that material teacup. What I'm talking about in uttering this judgment is what Moore calls presented object, something which is neither this material object itself nor something in my mind, but something of which I could believe or presume that it is part of the surface of the material object concerned. Put a little pause here. So we continue, and I think we've been talking about more and his sense data, or what he sometimes preferred to call them, sensibles. I will do a little retake here. The distinction by more can perhaps be brought out in this way. When, for example, I am looking at a certain physical object, a teacup, say, then what I am directly perceiving, or as Moore prefers to say, directly apprehending, is not the material teacup, but a sense datum of this teacup. My apprehending it, however, is not the same thing as the sense datum. I'm apprehending, it is a mental process which in turn can be the object of my attention. This is the reason why Moore keeps insisting on his distinction between sensations and sense data. Even if a sense data, as a matter of fact, exist unperceived, they are not mental occurrences of the same kind as our perceiving them, even if they are in some sense dependent on my mind. They are not dependent in the same way my seeing, hearing, etc. are dependent on my mind. As Moore puts it, I look at an envelope and I see a sense datum, a patch of whitish color, but now I immediately turn away my eyes and no longer see that sense datum. My seeing it of it has ceased to exist, but I am by no means sure that the sense datum, that very same patch of whitish color which I saw, is not still existing, whereas my seeing of it, it seems to me at least conceivable that it should be still existing, whereas my seeing of it certainly has ceased to exist. This is one reason for distinguishing between the stance data which I see and my seeing of them. But what are More's reasons for introducing sense data at all? It is remarkable that More does not seem very worried about this question. And this indicates a fundamental change of the philosophical climate between his day and ours. More was far more anxious to persuade his contemporary to accept the common sense belief in physical objects, the real existence of the world, etc., than to justify his assumption of the existence of sense data. And it may very well be the case that he himself saw fewer problems regarding their existence than regarding the past existence of the material world, for example. Accordingly, he does not make much of the usual argument from illusion, and similar attempts to justify the assumption of sense data, but simply proceeds to analyze the role which sense data are supposed to play in certain types of judgment, especially in judgments of perception. Let us take what More considers a typical judgment of perception, such as, "This is a teacup." Now, according to More, it is evident that this judgment is not a judgment about the material teacup standing on the sideboard, or at least not exclusively about the material teacup. What I'm talking about in uttering this judgment is what Moore calls a presented object, something which is neither the material object itself nor something in my mind, but something of which I could believe or presume that it is a part of the surface of the material object concerned. Now we're back where we left off. But if in judging that this is a teacup, I am really making a judgment about sense datum or a presented object, then I cannot possibly wish to say of this sense datum that it is a teacup. I may be unclear about the nature of sense data, but surely I do not believe that I can pour tea into them. What follows from this is that judgments of perception are to be analyzed in a way which is far more complicated than is suggested by their surface structure. The word "this" in "this is a teacup" is, according to Moore, to be taken to refer to a sense datum, while the predicate teacup says something about the material object standing in a certain relation to this sense datum. The simple reason why this, the object I am referring to in my judgment of perception, cannot be a material object is that I cannot normally directly see, a whole object. When I'm looking at a teacup, I only see part of the surface of a teacup, never a whole teacup. It would be different in the case of transparent objects, like soap bubbles or whiskey glasses. And for this reason more seriously considers the question of whether objects of this kind need to be treated in a different way from opaque objects, like glasses. But why does Moore think that judgments of perception are judgments about sense data, which at the same time, however, predicate something of material objects? After all, one might object, even if, as a matter of fact, my perceiving of physical objects always involves the direct apprehension of sense data. This does not obviously mean that what I am talking about are those sense data. Moore, although he does take this objection into consideration, does not seem to take it very seriously. He simply replies that in a certain sense it is correct to say that my judgment is about the material teacup, but the sense in which this is correct is not independent of my talking about the presented teacup, that is the sense datum. I hope you can follow, it's a bit complex. Accordingly, Moore claims we must distinguish between a sense in which we can be said to see the object, of which we predicate that it is a teacup, even though this object is never directly seen, and a sense in which we see the sense datum corresponding to that material teacup. There may, however, be yet a third sense of see, depending on whether the sense datum is identical with the seen surface of the material object concerned or not. That is, if what I directly apprehend in the process of seeing an object is part of the material object's surface, then this part of the surface and my sense datum are identical, and in this case no third sense of see is needed. But if my sense datum is to be regarded as distinct from the relevant part of the surface of that object, then we need a third sense of see for seeing that surface. And that will differ both from the sense in which I can be said to see a material object and the sense in which I can be said to see the corresponding sense datum. Whether we really need three senses of see or can make do with two senses of the word is a question to which Moore did not find a definite answer. Sometimes he inclined one way and sometimes the other. In some sense, the final answer seemed to him to depend on whether sense data could be said to continue to exist when they were no perceived any longer. Surfaces of material things can be said to exist even if they are not perceived. Thus, if sense data are identical with parts of the surfaces of physical objects, then it must make sense to claim that they can exist unperceived. On the other hand, it seems natural to suppose that sense data do not continue to exist when they cease to be given to a perceiving subject, and hence it seems unlikely that sense data can be understood to be identical with parts of its surfaces of material objects. Thus, in a reply to one of his critics, Moore confesses, "I am strongly inclined to take both of these incompatible views. I am completely puzzled about the matter, and I only wish I could see any way of settling it. Now we go to Wittgenstein's criticism of the whole matter. In Wittgenstein's writings after his return to Cambridge in 1929, problems of sense perception are discussed fairly frequently. It would, however, be misleading to say that Wittgenstein had a theory of perception. The concepts of seeing, immediate experience, visual, image, etc. crop up in all kinds of context, sometimes in order to be given detailed treatment, at other times merely to illustrate a given point. Wittgenstein's way of discussing these concepts is a very far cry from Moore's patient and somewhat repetitive way of dealing with his problems. Indeed, it is a very far cry from all earlier ways of doing philosophy. One of the main differences in Wittgenstein's is Wittgenstein's unprecedented insistence on what one may call the natural habitat of our concepts. That is the linguistic and non-linguistic context in which our expressions are normally used. It is this insistence on the natural habitat of our concepts which plays an important role in Wittgenstein's best-known discussion of concepts of perception. His treatment of the distinction between seeing something and seeing something as such and such. This distinction is dealt with in part 2 of the philosophical investigations, and at greater length in his remarks on the philosophy of psychology. by pointing out certain peculiarities of the actual use of the relevant expressions and the possible consequences of conceivable uses of these expressions. Wittgenstein shows the extent to which seemingly private experiences can be communicated and how little the solution of philosophical problems and puzzles depend on what cannot be communicated. Wittgenstein's remarks on the distinction between seeing and seeing as, and his discussion of the experience of seeing a certain aspect or a change of aspect are not directly related to the things that Moore has to say about perception. In the first half of the 1930s, however, both in his writings and his lectures, Wittgenstein talks about sense datum in a way which is directly relevant to the thesis maintained by Moore. In a lecture in 1935, Wittgenstein addresses himself to one of the questions which Moore had found so poignantly puzzling. He says, the philosopher does not tell us how to decide the question, whether or not a sense datum is identical with or part of the surface of an object, and the question whether the chair or its surface is brown. If these were questions of natural sciences, we should need to be told how to decide them, what the method of verification is. But how do we decide whether whiteness or a surface or a sense datum is circular? The philosopher does not tell us how to decide between these. And what is more confusing is that often a question such as this has an application, which makes a philosopher think it has when he asks it. Here, Wittgenstein claims that More's question regarding the identity of a sense datum with a surface of a physical object is pointless, even illegitimate. For the reason that More could not specify a method for verifying the statement that a given sense datum is identical with a certain surface. By implication, he says that there are or can be questions concerning sense data and surfaces which are not only intelligible but answerable. These questions, however, will not be philosophers' questions, but questions of science, questions, for example, regarding optical illusions or other strange phenomena of perception, which can be decided if a verification procedure is available. But why, we may ask ourselves, is it impossible to verify the philosopher's question? The most obvious and perhaps most satisfactory answer Wittgenstein gives to this question is that there is no criterion of identity of sense data in the philosopher's sense. To be sure, if in ordinary conversation my interlocutor answers the question as to what he has seen by drawing a picture or producing a photograph, the questions of whether he has seen the same thing as I have seen, or whether he has seen today the same thing he saw yesterday, can be answered. Here we have the evidence, we have criteria, and we know how to use them. Moore's question, on the other hand, about what is seen when I see a sense datum, does not admit of this type of answer. Sense data in Moore's sense are necessarily private. If I produce a photograph or a drawing, then what I or another person will directly see and we do not have the foggiest idea of how to find out whether this sense datum is the same as the former one. But even in this formulation, the problem still sounds far too reasonable. For according to Wittgenstein, there is no real problem here, but only confusion. For it is not that a criterion of identity has not yet been discovered, in which case we could still hope to find one. It is that there is no possible criterion of identity for the philosopher's notion of sense datum, both in the sense that such a sense datum is not accessible to other people, and in the sense that a past sense datum is not accessible to myself. Wittgenstein elucidates this point by means of examples about auditory and physical sounds. Can you in a continuous sound distinguish the part you are hearing at the moment and the part you remember hearing? You can hear a click, and there's no part of it which you can remember as coming before or after another part. Whereas with a sustained violin note, you can remember the part which has gone before. The problem then is to find an intermediate stage at which you can say you both hear and remember. The confusion lies in thinking that the physical sound and the sense datum are both continuous. The physical sound is continuous, but the sense datum is not. This, of course, applies not only to auditory sense data, but also visual ones. But even Wittgenstein's remark is not entirely fallacious. What he means is that of a sense datum, I cannot say that it has duration, and it would be equally nonsensical to assert that it has duration. Sense data simply are not objects of the type to which talk of duration applies. Now, one may wish to object that this is going too far. Either a sense datum has a duration or it has not. If it has not, then of course I cannot apply a criterion of identity, but that is because there simply is not enough time to apply it. But this is not Wittgenstein's view of the matter. He thinks that the language of everyday life, and this is the language whose concepts we normally discuss when doing philosophy, does not function like a well-constructed calculus, in that it does not always permit a yes-no answer to the question of whether a given predicate is true of a certain object. According to Wittgenstein, a statement makes sense only if the relevant expressions occurring in it are associated with certain criteria in such a way that procedures can be specified for deciding whether a predicate applies to this or that object, and under which circumstances an alleged object can be counted as one and the same. One result of this conception is that if in a given case there are no criteria to be applied, then the sentence in question does not make sense. But this does not mean that all senseless sentences are nonsense of the same type. There is, on the one hand, what we may wish to call simple nonsense. For example, this teacup is in B minor. Here, the simply is no procedure for deciding whether teacups are in B minor, or for that matter in any other key. And even if this sentence occurred as a line of a poem or a song, and thus acquired some emotional significance, it would still remain nonsense of the simple sort. On the other hand, there are sentences which lack sense in a different way. These are what Wittgenstein tends to call grammatical sentences. That is, sentences expressing rules or specifying conditions for the applications of rules, for the employment of linguistic expressions. Such sentences do have a use in our language games, Wittgenstein says, but this use is very specific and limited one. They can play a role in the context of teaching a language, or, for example, when reminding someone that he has misused a certain expression. Thus, if somebody tells a story in which two people are described as playing a game of patience, I may remind him that one plays patience by oneself. And this reminder is a grammatical sentence which does not supply any factual information, but indicates the correct way of using a given expression. For this reason, we may say of sentences of this type what Wittgenstein remarks apropos certain tautologies, namely that they are degenerate propositions on the side of truth. Even though grammatical sentences lack sense, they are not useless. However, they easily mislead us into thinking that they supply information about something. Thus, we may be led to believe that the statement that sense data are private expresses a discovery about sense data, whereas really it is no more than a grammatical reminder to the effect that when I speak of seeing, what another person sees, I may be talking about the object he is seeing, but not of his sense datum. Wittgenstein stresses this point in a remark of 1934 or 35 from his notes for lectures on private experience and sense data. Time to end there. No, this was a bit stilted read, but this is so absolutely important and hard to grasp. Just stay in there. Access to this is eased by going slowly. Wittgenstein